is on
Wait,
his
wait, 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 just a second. Wait, now we are on. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. This is Valley Bechalem Lunch and Learn for Purim, the eve of Purim. And we're going to begin today's lesson with a few words from Brother Workman.
and Altakaker is on his deathbed.
That's an old person, a person of advanced ages.
His daughter is next to him, and she is just bawling and wailing. And he's on his last breaths. And, he gets a whiff, and he says, "Oh, your mother's kugel. Isn't it the most beautiful thing in the world?" You know this joke. I can see by that face.
I do this for a living, remember? Go ahead.
Okay. And his mother's kugel. It would be to send me to heaven with your mother's kugel would be the greatest thing that could ever possibly happen to me. She goes downstairs to try and get the kugel. And, and she comes back in tears, and she says, "Okay, where's the kugel?" I said, "Well, I went to cut a slice. She slapped my hand. She said it was for the shiva."
Bump. That's a very good one. That actually is a good one. There's an off-color version of it. There's the one where the old couple is together and it's in their last days, and he turns to her and says, "Honey, we've enjoyed a life together. We had 10 children. But they all look different. And I'm just wondering, especially the 10th one, whose child is he?" And she says, "Yes, honey, I have to confess to you that they all come from different places. The 10th one, he's yours." Anyway, sorry. I'm sorry.
I like that.
It's Purim. It's getting close. It's getting close. Anyway, welcome. It's good to have you here. We're doing some learning together, Erev Purim, which is always a sweet thing. Now, we've been looking at the book of Job, which is not a Purim-dic book. It's not a Purim story, of course, but it's a wonderful, remarkable piece of Jewish literature and thinking. And I want to go back and we're going to move forward. We're going to move forward today. I'm going to have a little short session today because I have to run, but I want to take a look at in the next section, but I want to recap where we've come. When you open a book, even a book of the Bible, you open a book, an ancient book, we open with the assumption that we're reading something which is a unitary piece of literature, a sort of coherent piece of literature with a point of view. The book of Job, you open the book and you read it that way, and many traditional authors have read it that way. Many traditional authors have found a way to read the book as if it were written by just one person, right? But what happens is, as you read it, you realize that that's a very strained interpretation, right? Very, very strained interpretation, very difficult interpretation. First of all, because the book shows us very different kinds of literature. It begins with a prose tale, and it moves from the prose tale into poetry, into a poetic dialogue, and then it moves from the poetic dialogue into a series of monologues or soliloquies. And the genre, the literary style of each of these sections is very different. The vocabulary is very different. The literary images are very different. It doesn't look like it's been written by one hand. But then the question is, okay, so maybe this isn't one author. Maybe what we have is a set of pieces of literature that were gathered together, a sort of anthology. But does it have a point of view? Because after all, you could have an anthology and still have a point of view, right? But here too, as you read the text, you discover that there are multiple points of view being presented in the text of the book, right? For example, the beginning of the book is a prose tale. The prose tale is dealing with the most central issue, I think, of religion in general, but certainly the most central issue of the wisdom tradition of the Bible. Does virtue bring reward? And does sin bring punishment? And if a person is punished, or suffering, can we assume that that person has sinned? That's the recompense for sin. Is there a divine moral order to the world? Does God watch the world and execute judgment in the world. And if a person is suffering, are they the subjects of God's judgment? And what is the relationship between God and human behavior? How does God look at human behavior? And at the beginning, we're presented with the story of a very pious man named Job, who lives an exemplary pious life. And then he's tortured. He's tortured by the Satan, in this case, God's sort of prosecuting angel, who wishes to find out. He runs a little science experiment because he's interested in the contradiction between pure piety and pure virtue and the rewards that it brings. If we believe that piety, that virtue brings rewards, is a person pious because they're pious, or is a person pious because they want to earn the rewards? Is there any sincere piety in the world? Any sincere virtue in the world? So what Satan, as it were, the Satan, proposes to God is a science experiment. Let's take your righteous man. Let's remove all the rewards we've given him. Let's torture him terribly, and let's see what he does. Let's see if he curses you. The great question that hangs over this book is, will he curse God? Will he give up his loyalty to God? And the prose tale, that the little story at the beginning, the first 2 chapters, he doesn't. First, he loses his children, he loses his wealth, he loses his power and position. He doesn't curse God. Then he loses his health and he suffers terribly, and he doesn't curse God. So the prose tale comes out saying there really is true piety in the world. But the problem is we're left with a terrible, terrible sense of bitterness in our mouths when we read the story. Because instead of having admiration for Job for putting up with all of this torture and not cursing God at the end, we wonder, what motivated God to do such a thing to a person? I mean, if virtue brings reward, why would you torture a guy who's virtuous? And why would you do this to a man? And that question that is left unanswered at the end of the first 2 chapters is what motivates the next section, which is not a prose tale anymore. It's now in poetry, and it's a dialogue. And one of the questions about a dialogue in any literature, by the way, is, what is the author's point of view? Is Job the author's point of view, and the friends, as it were, of Job who come, are they simply a foil in order to get him to express his point of view? Or are the friends' point of view part of the author's exploration of the ideas that are being presented here? Do they capture the author as well? And we have a set of debates. There's 3 rounds, and there are 3 friends, so it ends up being 9. And then there's another guy who's coming, and that's in the next section. And what happens is we have the first round, and in the first round, the 3 friends come to Job and they present him with 3 basic ideas. Number 1, that God is just, and therefore if you're suffering, it's because you sinned. Number 2, you can repent that sin and God will be good to you. And number 3, even if you don't know what the sin is, it's entirely possible that God knows things about you that you don't know about you, that you sinned in some secret, surreptitious way, in a way that you're hiding from yourself or didn't even know yourself. And that's why you're being punished. So you can see what they're trying to do is deal with an anomaly to their worldview. They have a worldview that the world runs on a certain set of rules. And here is a guy whose experience violates their sense of how the world works. And they are desperate to put the world back together that way. And Job keeps showing up after each speech of his so-called friends. And he says, no, I'm not a sinner. God isn't just. And he takes this idea of God. He says, you maintain that God is just, but you also maintain that God is other, that God isn't like human beings. So how do we know God is just? And how do we know that God's justice is the same as our justice? And how do we know that we can count on that justice? And that's Job's response. And the literary technique, as it were, that the author puts into Job's mouth is that Job says, I want a trial. Now you can make a joke about Jews suing each other, but I mean, the point here is that Job says it's a legal procedure, because in a legal procedure, we can really find out if there's justice. But the problem is that in a legal procedure, we stand as equals before a judge, before the court. And God would never tolerate that. So if God is not the same as us, if God is entirely on a different plane of reality than we human beings, so there can never be a trial, can we ever really say that God is just? And that becomes Job's sort of complaint. That's Job's charge. And that comes through. So in the first section, the first three speeches, that's presented. In the second three speeches, that's presented even stronger. And the third set of speeches falls apart. Eliphaz, who's the first of the friends, gives a speech. Bildad, who's the second of the friends, gives a half a speech, and then it stops. It's almost like you can feel the dialogue petering out. I know you ever had one of these arguments with a relative at a Seder table or a Shabbos table or a Thanksgiving table, and at a certain point you just say, whatever. It's just not even worth fighting about, because this person's not listening to me. I'm never going to get anywhere with this person. And so the third section, the third set of dialogues just sort of peters out. And we're left unresolved. You don't know, like, who won? Like, whose truth is there? You're left with an unresolved sense of what's going on. Then there's a sort of digression. There's another guy, a fourth friend, not a friend, but a neighbor, who's overhearing the conversation. His name is Elihu. And he shows up and restates the arguments of the friends. But he doesn't really advance the conversation. And then in the end of the book, we have a third confrontation. So we had prose tale, then we had dialogue, and now we have a third one. And these are soliloquies, that is, speeches, monologues, one by Job, and then an answer by God. That's right. At the end of this book, God shows up. Kind of remarkable when you think about it. I don't know how many of you are allowed to watch Woody Allen movies anymore. Once upon a time, they were very popular. So in the movie Annie Hall, he's waiting in line at the movie theater, and there's some guy spouting off about Marshall McLuhan and media. And Woody Allen looks at the camera, looks right at the audience, and he says, I can't take this anymore. So he goes behind a sign and he pulls out Marshall McLuhan. And Marshall McLuhan himself turns to the guy spouting out and says, you don't understand anything that I wrote. And Woody Allen turns back to the camera and says, wouldn't it be great if this happened in real life? And then, but this is what happens in the book of Job. Like Job has been fetching and saying, I want to talk to God. I want to talk to God, bring God on. And God shows up. And so we have a set of speeches by Job, and then a set of speeches by God. And we have another confrontation. But the Job of this set of speeches, that is in the third section of the book, not the prose tale and no longer the dialogue. I want to call this testimony, because they're just speeches, they're monologues. This is a different Job than the one we met elsewhere. He's not confident. He's not the pious sufferer of the first section, but nor is he the angry accuser, the antagonist of the dialogue. He has a different tone. And then God is going to show up, and God is going to give his point of view, which is going to surprise you. But we weren't going to get that today. Let's take a look at Job's speech today, and then we'll come back next week and we'll look at God's answer. And with that, we'll wrap up our learning of Job. So let me stop for a second. Having done this whole summary, any questions from anyone? Any questions from our studio audience here? Anyone questions? So far, so good. I think I've stumped you all. This is great. Wonderful. All right, so let's take a look inside. I'm going to put a text up on the screen. Here we go. So we're up to chapter 29. Okay, this is after the dialogues. This is not a dialogue. This is a long speech. And Job starts out by saying that I was in the months gone by, in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone over my head, when I walked in dark by its light, when I was in my prime, when God's company graced my tent, when Shaddai was still with me, when my lads surrounded me, when my feet were bathed in cream. That's an interesting image, isn't it? What's it mean to be a rich guy? You soak your feet in ice cream, right? in Rocky Road. And rocks poured out streams of oil from me when I passed through the city gates to take my seat in the square. So who is he? He's the village elder. He is one of the elders of the village, and he's a respected man. And he says, I remember those days gone by. I remember those days when I walked through the city and young men saw me and hid and elders rose and stood. I was important and people revered me and respected me. Nobles held back their words. They clapped their hands to their mouths. The voices of princes were hushed. Their tongues stuck to their palates. The ear that heard acclaimed me. The eye that saw condemned me. Right? Commended me. For I saved the poor who cried out, the orphan who had none to help him. So this is Job testifying, and we don't know who he's talking to. He's really not talking to anyone, not talking to God, and not talking to the friends anymore. I think he's talking to the city, to the village. And he's saying, I remember the days when I was an important leader in this city. I saved the poor man who cried out and the orphan who had none to help him. I received the blessing of the lost. I gladdened the heart of the widow. I clothed myself in righteousness and it robed me. Justice was my cloak. I was the eyes to the blind and the feet to the lame. I was the father to the needy. I looked to the case of the stranger. I broke the jaws of the wrongdoer and I wrestled prey from their teeth. And I really thought I would end my days with my family and be as long-lived as a phoenix, my roots reaching the water and the dew lying on the branches, my vigor refreshed, my bow in my hand. I lived a life of righteousness. And I expected to retain the rewards of that righteousness, to be respected, to be revered, to be loved, and to live long. And now he goes back to his theme. Men would listen to me expectantly, wait for my counsel. And he goes back to that. I lived like a king among the troops. Right? But, and now comes the but. Here is his description of himself now. Things changed. Something changed in my life. But now those younger than me deride me. Men whose fathers I would have disdained to put among my sheepdogs, of what use to me is the strength of their hands. He said, I used to be a person that everyone respected because they knew my wisdom and they knew my righteousness. But now, these people of no repute, of no significance, they mock me. They make fun of me. I am the butt of their jibes. I have become a byword to them. They abhor me. They keep their distance. They do not withstand spittle in my face. So what happened to him? He's been ostracized. Something has happened to him and he's been sent out of the village. He's no longer an elder of the village, no longer respected member of the community. No longer does he earn the reverence of those around him. And he talks about how difficult this is for him. Terror tumbles among me. It sweeps away my honor like wind. My dignity vanishes like a crowd. It's interesting because you see in the beginning of the story, we assumed that he'd lost his kids, he'd lost his wealth, he lost his health. But here, the thing that he's complaining about is that he's lost his social position. He's no longer an important person. He is completely anonymous to the world. No one sees him. He's invisible, right? I cry out, but you, God, don't answer me. I wait, but you don't consider me. You have become cruel to me. That's the line. He's suffering this, and he understands that this is God's doing. And he says, you have become cruel to me. You have turned your back, right? Your powerful hand, you harass me, you lift me up and mount me like the wind. And now he goes back and he said, but what did I do to deserve this? Did I not weep for the unfortunate or grieve for the needy? I looked forward to going in good fortune, but evil came. And this is his concern, right? And the problem, and here he turns to God and he says what? Surely God would not strike at the needy if in calamity one cried to him. So here's his case. Here's Job's case. Job says, I was an elder of the land. I took care of people. I took care of the people who were weaker than me. I took care of the needy and the vulnerable in the community. God is supposed to do that too, but now that I'm in need, where is that God? Where is that God to imitate the same ethic that I lived when I was on top, when I was in power? Where is that God? And what's so interesting about this Job, it's so different than the previous one, is he's completely sure of his righteousness. He's completely sure of that he's deserving of blessing. But instead, he's receiving this curse, this terrible sense of ostracism from the community, his exile from the community. But unlike the dialogues, which is the section just before this, he doesn't accuse God. It's very clever the way he does this. When my mother raised 4 boys. I'm the oldest of 4 very rambunctious young kids. And we made a lot of noise and we made a lot of mess and we fought like hell. And my poor mother had to deal with us. And she would yell and she would scream. And yes, sometimes she would even whack us a little bit. It was allowed in those days. Today it's child abuse, but back then it was considered healthy discipline, to give a pachin tuchas, But when my mother would really lose it, when she would really lose it, when we would really push her over the edge, she got really quiet. That was scary. She wouldn't yell. She wouldn't scream. She wouldn't threaten. She would say to us, boys, you're better than this. You're better than this. And it was such an interesting technique because, how do you argue with that? You can't argue with that. You can't argue with that because it's not a punishment. You see, it's not an accusation. It's not an indictment. It asks you to join in your own indictment, right? Of course you're better than this. You're always better than this. That's the point. And in a certain way, that's what Job says to God. In the dialogues that came before this, in the dialogues with the 3 friends, he accuses God of injustice. He castigates God. He points a finger at God. Here, he doesn't accuse, because if I point a finger at you and I accuse you of something, you become defensive. You say, no, I didn't. But what if I say to you, I understand. Look what you did. I think you're better than this. I really think you're better than this. It's a wonderful way of getting a person to join you in their own indictment. I think you're a better person than this. You're a better Jew than this. You're a better kid than this, right? And Job says, you're a better God than this. You're a better God than this. Come and join me and fix this. And he puts God, he doesn't accuse God of being unjust. What he does instead, which is so interesting, is he points to God and he says, you are the source of justice. That's what you do. But look at me. Look what's happened to me. Now help me, because you're better than this. Now, in the 3rd chapter of this soliloquy, of this monologue, this speech, he takes a series of oaths. And this is a classic form of biblical truth-telling. If you go to court, and in court, if you have to establish a fact in court that can't be established with evidence, right? So I find an object and I say, I found it. And you show up and say, but it's mine. And I say, well, how do I know it's yours? It has no distinguishing marks. You make a vow and you say, I vow that that's my object, right? And a vow counts in a court, in a Jewish court, in a biblical or a Talmudic court. And part of a vow is to say, if I'm right, let this happen to me. Right? That's the sort of form of a vow. If I'm right, let this happen. And if I'm wrong, let this happen to me. Okay? And that's the form of Job's vows. Because now he says, listen, if I'm not righteous, let punishment fall on my head. But if I'm righteous, God, you got to do the right thing. You're better than this. You've got to do the right thing. He said, I've covenanted with my eyes not to gaze on a maiden. What fate is decreed by God above? What lot by Shaddai in the heights? Calamity is sure for the iniquitous, misfortune for the worker of mischief. He is affirming the justice of the universe, just like the friends did in the dialogue. But he's saying, surely he observed my ways, takes account of every step. God, you got to see me. You got to fix this. Have I walked with worthless men? Or my feet hurried to deceit? Let him weigh me on the scales of righteousness. Let God ascertain my integrity. My feet have strayed from their course. If my feet have strayed from their course, if my heart followed after my eyes, may I sow, but another reap. May the growth of the field be uprooted. And that's the form of this 3rd chapter, where he goes through each of these different forms of morality. Talks about sexual morality, the way he treats women, talks about civic morality, the way he treated the poor and the vulnerable in the community, talks about business morality, talks about every single, and he says, if I didn't do right, strike me down. But if I did what I think I did, you owe me something. And what that does is it reinforces God's position. It reinforces God's position as a God of justice. He is actually arguing the friend's case in the dialogue in this section, because he's affirming that this is a God of justice who rewards virtue and punishes sin. And he says, but look at me. If that's the case, no, you owe me. And that's the case that he presents in this section. Now, the question is, does it work? Does it convince you? Does it help? Does it answer any of the questions that we asked before? Does virtue bring reward and sin bring punishment? Is suffering the result of having violated one of God's strictures of morality? Does God judge human beings carefully? Can you ask God to observe a rule of justice in the world? One of the things that you'll notice in this section is he's so sure of himself. He's so sure of himself. And he's so sure that his picture of God is right. And he's so sure that his picture of reality is right. And what happens then is that he is completely unready to accept the fact that there might be something in the universe called tragedy. And I don't know if you've ever met people like this who just can't abide by the idea that the world just might not be fair. And what's going to happen in the answer that's going to come next is that God is going to show up and say to him, there's more going on in reality than your small understanding of this. Because there really is, the question now is there a tragic theme, a tragic element to the human condition? The Job of chapters 29, 30, and 31 wants to say, no, everything works out just the way it's supposed to. And the rest of the book of Job says, really? You really think so? That's really how you look at it? So let's stop there for a second. Questions? Yes, Stan.
The other thing that I get out of this is that when Job had all these blessings and he helped all these people, then he was a righteous man in the community. Everybody looked up to him. When everything was taken away, nobody looked up to him. He couldn't do anything, and the people no longer respected him particularly. And is that what we see in our communities? Unless, we see someone who's actually doing something, they lose our respect.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I have a experience talking to cancer patients, and one of the complaints that they'll make, and they won't tell you if you're not a cancer patient, so I can reveal this way. As I say, I had these friends, we used to go to lunch all the time, and when I was diagnosed with cancer, they stopped going to lunch with me, and I don't know why, right? If someone wears a shmata on their head because they've taken chemotherapy and they lost their hair, and this woman says, this man says, my friends don't call me anymore. They don't want to be with me. And it's scary and it's lonely. And, so I explain to them, it's because they don't know how to talk to you. People think it's contagious, but the question is, do we ostracize people who are suffering? Especially people who suffer loudly. If you suffer quietly, you're a hero. But not everybody can suffer so quietly. You get an oy or a krach, or sometimes. Do we do that to people? Like, we don't want to be too close because they might jinx us somehow. And that's what he's talking about. He's suffering, but he's suffering double. First, he's suffering from the terrible things that happened to him, and then he's suffering the ostracism, the exile of the community, because nobody wants to be with him, either because he keeps complaining. Or worse, they don't want to be with him because people don't like being around people that are suffering because it doesn't make them feel good. It brings them down, and they don't want the responsibility of offering support and of care. Yeah, Andy.
I was looking this part over while you were talking about it, and it reminded me of, I want to say, it's called linear thinking, or actually, like, I call it light switch thinking.
Mm.
If I do everything I'm supposed to do, the light goes on, and if I don't do it, it's wrong. So that means it's off. So it's a very simple concept. So it's there's no gray, there's
That's
no
right.
abstract.
That's right. He is a very black and white, dualistic thinker. And what's going to happen is you're going to see next week is the Bible's going to show up and say, no, life is much more complicated than this. But you're exactly right. You ever meet people like this? It's very interesting. It's a very interesting worldview. Sometimes it can be very powerful because it tells somebody, I know the world is good. So if something's wrong, it must be. They really have a conviction. And they'll try to fit every fact into that conviction. They'll hammer every fact so that it fits their conviction. But the problem is that, as you said, it's never that easy. It's always more complicated. And then what's really difficult, of course, is that sometimes those people become judgmental, right? You must have done something wrong. Tell you that. It's your own damn fault, right? Your own damn fault. Why'd you get cancer? Well, you ate all that chazarai that your mother told you not to eat. It's your own damn fault. And, you say, but I didn't, yes, of course, and it becomes very judgmental. That dualistic thinking, they're not easy people to live with. I don't know if you've ever had to live or spend Thanksgiving with. Right. Phyllis, yes, please.
In an earlier session, you said that Job was not a Jew. And
Correct.
This is killing me a lot. If he's not a Jew, he has this relationship with God.
Yes.
What is he? He's not a heathen.
He's not. He's a believer of independent believer. But see, the Bible's using him as a cipher, as a symbol for all humanity. He doesn't have a special relationship with God that Abraham has. He represents all humanity in its relationship with its creator. Okay? David, you're going to get the last question because I have to run. So ask a quick question and I'll give you a short answer.
I'm sorry, it's not really a question. It strikes me that this addresses the most difficult part of life.
It is. This book is the most difficult book in the Bible because this question of, is there justice and does my suffering have meaning? And is there a God who pays attention? And what can I ask of that God and expect of that God? These questions are the most painful, most difficult, most challenging. And this book is, as Andy pointed out, this book is so sophisticated in so many ways, so modern in the sense that it's so nuanced in the way that it's going to argue these issues without giving us resolution. I'm going to warn you now, next week, we're going to meet God and you're going to be really angry at him when we're done. And you're going to say, how can a book leave me angry with God? That's not fair. It's not a Bible book. And that's exactly the right response. Bert.
What I'm sensing is Job's ingrained worldview is being shook so much that he can't deal with it. In the same sense that if you get fundamentalists today, they have a view and you can't shake it.
Yeah.
And the only resolution they can come to is it's unfair.
Yes.
But it's unfair.
But you see, that's Job of chapters 29 and 30 and 31. And the Bible's not going to let us rest with that. The Bible's going to attack that next. Okay. And we don't have enough time today to get into the attack. So we're going to do it next week. But I promise you, by next week, you're going to go, now I see. Douglas.
If Job is doing the actions for the reward, then, it's sort of like a pet trick. I mean,
right.
Shouldn't the reward for a mitzvah be the act of doing the mitzvah?
That's one of the questions. But is there a moral reciprocity? If God has promised blessing, can then he take it away? That's the question. Can you ever know this? That's exactly the question at the beginning of the book. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for having to cut this a little short today, but I got to run. But I want to wish everybody a really good Purim. Tomorrow night's Purim. If you have no place else to go, come on to VBS. We have a full Megillah reading starting at 5 with Yossi Dresner. We have a wonderful little kids program at 5:30 with puppets. We have a wonderful music extravaganza at 7 o'clock online. And then if you want to come to the shul, you can drive through the streets of Shushan. It's quite remarkable. This is how you do Purim in the age of COVID. And of course, it all is better, except for the driving part, if you have a little schnapps. So I recommend pick the schnapps of your choice. That's why God created Scotland, to give us single malt, right? But whatever schnapps you're into, a little schnapps, a little tequila is good. It says that in the prayer, Kihu Yom tequila. So take a little and enjoy. I'll see you later. Take